Ever feel like you're fighting a battle you just can't win? Imagine going head-to-head with an army of emus and still coming up short. That's the bizarre yet true story of the Great Emu War of Australia. Stick around as we dive into this feathery fiasco, uncovering surprising insights and how sometimes the underdog or underbird can teach us the most about resilience. So let's flock together and unravel this wild tale. Ready for a story you won't forget? Keep watching. Before we begin, hit that like and subscribe button or you might become the next strategic target in an emu's grand battle plan. In the vast sun-baked plains of Western Australia, the Great Depression loomed heavy over the 1930s, a time of hardship and dust-laden tales. There, the farmers, already buckling under the strain of economic turmoil, were about to face an adversary of unexpected feathers and persistence. As the fertile grounds of Central Australia succumbed to drought, the great emu, a large, flightless bird native to the continent, began its annual migration in search of food and water. But this was no ordinary year, and the unwitting emus stumbled upon lands rich with newly cultivated wheat crops. Fields carefully sown by farmers became feasting grounds for thousands of hungry birds. With their long legs and swift gait, the emus devoured crop after crop, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Their numbers were in the tens of thousands, and as they descended upon these fields, they seemed like an unstoppable force of nature, their very presence emblematic of the farmer's plight. And compounding this dire situation, the emus possessed an uncanny ability to evade attempts at control. Farmers would erect fences, only to watch them being trampled beneath the birds' powerful legs. They tried to scatter them, to shoo them away, but against such a multitude, their efforts were in vain. With each passing day, the frustration and desperation grew. The very livelihood of these toiling land workers was under siege. The struggle soon reached a breaking point. Crops needed to both feed the families and pay off debts were relentlessly pillaged by the emus' insatiable appetites. The farmers were facing ruin, with some reports suggesting that a single emu could consume up to 10 pounds of wheat in a day. It was clear that something needed to be done, a solution to be found to ward off the avian invaders. The farmers' pleas for help grew louder, more urgent, and before long, their voices reached the corridors of power, the government itself. It would lead to a decision as bizarre as it was unprecedented, the call for military intervention. And thus, the stage was set for what would become known in history as the Great Emu War, a conflict where feathers would fly and humanity's will would be tested by nature's resilience. But as the farmers would soon discover, this was no ordinary enemy. It was one that would not yield to the tactics of man so easily. The emus had the upper hand, but the fight for the right to the land was only just beginning. As the emu crisis escalated, the beleaguered farmers turned desperately towards the Australian government, their pleas echoing the very depths of their struggle. With conventional methods failing and livelihoods teetering on the brink, they sought an unconventional solution. They called for military aid to combat the feathered invaders that laid waste to their crops. In an extraordinary move, the government responded. Attention turned to a military man, Major G.P.W. Meredith, and his light horsemen. These men were not strangers to conflict, yet little did they anticipate the unusual foe they were about to face. With orders received and spirits steeled, they prepared to launch an offensive that would be etched into the annals of history for its sheer peculiarity. Armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and a supply of 10,000 rounds of ammunition, Major Meredith and his men set out in November 1932. Their mission was clear: to reduce the emu population and protect the livelihoods of Western Australia's farming community. But emus proved to be erratic targets. Their scatter and sprint tactics confounded the soldiers. Early engagements revealed the challenges ahead. For every emu felled, countless more slipped through the military's grasp. Nevertheless, Major Meredith was resolved to carry out his orders, to utilize his military acumen against a foe that neither marched nor saluted, but ran with a wild unpredictability across the Australian outback. And so, the Great Emu War commenced, not with the sound of trumpets or thunderous charge, but with the rattle of machine gun fire and the flutter of startled wings. The farmers watched with bated breath as the soldiers took aim, hopeful that this show of force would finally turn the tide in their favor and bring peace back to their ravaged fields. But as the campaign unfolded, it would become clear that this war was unlike any other. The birds, seemingly ungovernable by the laws of man or beast, continued their rampage. With each passing skirmish, the emu's resilience suggested that victory would not come easily, if at all. Major Meredith and his men delved deeper into the Australian outback, the lines between hunter and hunted growing ever fainter beneath the scorching sun. The battlefield was the vast and rugged expanse of the Australian outback, where the military, under Major Meredith's command, began implementing their strategy. The plan was straightforward: use the mobility of soldiers and the might of machine guns to cull the emu population, which had swelled to overwhelming numbers. Initially, the military believed that their superior firepower would swiftly bring the emus to heel. The Lewis guns, revered for their reliability in the trenches of World War I, were positioned at strategic points where the emus were known to gather or run. The soldiers waited, the guns trained on their feathered targets, aiming to inflict maximum casualties. But the emus, it seemed, had tactics of their own. They scattered in small, elusive groups, blurring the line of fire with their erratic movements. The birds' quick pace and unpredictable zigzagging runs made them tough to track. When one fell, others surged forward, unfazed by the barrage of bullets. The very nature of their movements rendered the soldiers' efforts almost ineffective. Further complicating the military's efforts was the environment itself. The rough terrain made it difficult for the soldiers to move quickly and set up their equipment. The relentless heat and thick scrub offered perfect cover for the retreating birds, who could disappear out of sight in an instant. In one of the engagements, Major Meredith mounted one of the machine guns on a truck. A mobile approach, he reasoned, would match the emu's speed. But the plan backfired. The truck couldn't keep pace with the speeding emus over uneven ground, rendering the gunner unable to fire accurately. The cunning emus evaded capture and injury, once again slipping away. Faced with these trials, the soldiers' morale started to wane. The early optimism faded as each strategy seemed only to underscore the emu's surprising ability to survive, and the birds' endurance became a symbol of the land they roamed, untamed, resilient, and indomitable. As days passed, ammunition dwindled, and the body count of emus remained far below expectations. The operation started to draw criticism. Was the use of military force against wildlife justified? Could the emu population ever be effectively controlled by such means? These were questions that the soldiers, the farmers, and all of Australia would have to grapple with as the Great Emu War pressed on. As the battles against the emus continued, word of the unusual military operation spread beyond the scorched fields and into the public consciousness. An air of disbelief took hold as the war on wildlife made headlines, not just at home but across the world. Satirical cartoons and bemused newspaper commentaries painted a picture of incredulity. The notion of an army pitted against birds struck many as absurd. The theater of the bizarre played out in the open expanse of the Australian bush. The public response was a mixture of amusement and confusion. Citizens, already weary from the grips of the Great Depression, found in the saga a kind of tragicomedy, where the machinery of war met the stubbornness of nature. People began to mock the situation, coining the conflict as the Emu War, an endearing name for a fiasco that belied a deeper sense of the ridiculousness of the situation. Politically, the response was more fractious. Members of Parliament questioned the wisdom of the strategy, the expenditure and utilization of defense resources on a wild goose, rather emu, chase. In the halls of power, discussions grew heated, as opposition politicians seized upon the emu campaign as emblematic of the government's mismanagement and outlandish policies. Was this a rational way to protect agricultural interests, or a misguided adventure on the public purse? Even the soldiers themselves, facing their non-human adversaries, began to express their doubts. Reports from the field highlighted the ineffectiveness of the mission. They commented on the tenacity and evasiveness of the emus, acknowledging a respect for the birds that seemed to be winning this unconventional war. Overseas, international observers watched in disbelief as tales of the conflict made their way into foreign newspapers. There was a certain fascination with the story, an incredulity that captivated readers who could scarcely believe that the prestigious Australian military had been reduced to fighting flightless birds. Back home, as the criticism mounted and political pressure increased, the government could no longer ignore the voices of discontent. The defense minister found himself under a particularly harsh spotlight, forced to defend the operation against the relentless pecking of both political opposition and public opinion. It wasn't long before the military campaign against the emus, which had started with a sense of urgency and necessity, teetered on the brink of becoming a national embarrassment. As the government grappled with the fallout, the Great Emu War was proving to be more than a struggle with nature. It was a battle for the credibility of those in power, an episode that would leave an indelible mark on Australia's history. After weeks of chasing shadows across the outback, the inefficiency of the military operation against the emus became abundantly clear. The soldiers, equipped with the might of the machine gun, had anticipated a quick victory over the feathered inhabitants of Western Australia. But the emus, with their remarkable speed and propensity for guerrilla-like evasion, had other plans. Each report that made its way back to the government painted a picture of futility and misdirected effort. For all the rounds expended, the number of birds culled fell embarrassingly short of expectations. The soldiers had been outmaneuvered by their avian adversaries on almost every front. As the cost of the campaign mounted, both in terms of resources and public relations, it became impossible to justify the continuation of the operation. The birds' persistence in the face of adversity came to be seen as a sort of victory dance. The emus had withstood the full force of a modern military assault and had emerged, by and large, unscathed. Their unwitting resilience had turned them into an unwitting symbol of resistance against the odds, an ironic twist that did not escape the already chagrined Australian populace. Faced with the unpalatable reality of a war that could not be won, the military made the decision to withdraw. Major Meredith and his men, once tasked with solving the emu problem by force, stood down, their campaign brought to an ignominious end. The Great Emu War had come to a close, and the birds, it seemed, had emerged victorious. In the aftermath of the military's disengagement, a new approach was sought. The government, keen to demonstrate some measure of control over the situation, introduced a bounty system as a way of encouraging civilians to take up the task where the military had failed. Each emu captured or killed by a farmer would result in a payment, turning the endeavor into a profit-driven enterprise rather than a military exercise. And so the narrative shifted. No longer was it the Australian military versus the outback's emus. Instead, it became a chapter of individual Australians rising to the challenge, incentivized by a government keen to put the emu debacle behind them. The bounty system, it was hoped, would bring order to the chaos. The livelihoods of Western Australia's farmers still hung precariously in the balance, and the emus, unwitting combatants in this human scheme, continued to roam their ancient lands. With a new page turned, all eyes watched as a different sort of battle began to unfold, one where every farmer was now a soldier, and every emu was a chance for redemption. The dust has long settled on the battlefields of the Great Emu War, but its echoes reverberate through the years, reaching into the heart of contemporary Australian culture. The tale of the feathered David and the Goliath of government serves as a curious anecdote, a quirky chapter in the nation's history that often finds itself recounted with a mix of humor and disbelief. Throughout Australia and beyond, the Emu War has taken on a life of its own, immortalized in documentaries, books, and social media. It's become a popular reference in discussions about odd historical events, and is sometimes used to symbolize the futility of certain human endeavors. The image of a wild emu has become an icon of resistance, a reminder of nature's indomitable will. But beneath the veneer of folklore and mirth, there's a deeper narrative, one that speaks to environmental management and the relationship between humans and the natural world. The Emu War stands as a stark lesson in the unintended consequences of human intervention in ecosystems. The birds were, after all, only following their instinctual migration patterns disrupted by the agricultural development that had encroached upon their habitat. In the years since the failed campaign, strides have been made in understanding the delicate balance required when managing and interacting with the environment. It's taught the importance of respecting wildlife, of seeking coexistence rather than dominion. While culling still remains a practice in certain areas of wildlife management, it is now approached with greater caution and consideration, often as a last resort. Conservation biology and ecological science have grown, informed by lessons such as those from the Great Emu War, highlighting the need to prioritize sustainability and work towards solutions that benefit both human and animal communities. Whether it's through the creation of wildlife corridors that allow safe passage for migratory species, or the implementation of more humane and ecologically sound farming practices, a greater awareness has emerged. In the end, the Great Emu War offers a reflection on how, when faced with the forces of nature, humanity would do well to remember its role as steward rather than conqueror, Our actions have far-reaching consequences, and it is through understanding, planning, and respect for the natural world that we can avoid the mistakes of the past and foster a future where both people and wildlife thrive. The Emu War, while a military defeat, has become a cultural victory, teaching generations the value of living in harmony with the ecosystems we inhabit. It's a narrative that continues to resonate, a reminder that the wings of history often leave an indelible pattern on the path ahead. Thank you for joining us on this wild journey through the Great Emu War of Australia. If you enjoyed this incredible story and want more captivating content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on our future videos. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue to bring you fascinating tales like this one. Stay tuned for more exciting adventures and untold histories. Thank you for watching.